Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Mike Whitmer. Before we get started, I have a few housekeeping items that I'd like to review. Today's webinar is pre-recorded to accommodate schedules. As a result, we won't be able to take your questions live, but if you do have questions for our guest, please contact us through the contact feature on ncmic.com or simply give us a call at 800-247-8043. We'd be happy to connect you with resources to help. The webinar recording will be emailed to registered attendees following the program, and we'll also post the recording in the resources section of ncmic.com following the broadcast. But let's get started. This is the first of 4 special webinars that we're presenting during 2024. Whether you're buying, selling, or building a practice, you'll learn important information that's going to pay off in the long run. To help us navigate these complex issues, we've invited Crystal Missenheimer, lead broker from Progressive Practice Sales. Crystal's been a guest before on our webinars, and we've had such great response to the content that Crystal brings that we wanted to have her back to do a series of webinars on topics of building your practice value, thoughtful succession planning, purchasing a practice. There are so many issues that we can talk to Crystal about. So this is a very popular topic, and I'm looking forward to learning a lot through this process. So for the first of the 4 webinars, we're focusing on a really key topic for practice owners, and that's how do we build the value of the chiropractic practice as part of a retirement plan. Doctors many times are relying on the sale of their practice to fund their retirements. But this isn't something that happens automatically or overnight. It takes time to build, but also a strategy and focus. I liken this to an employee saving for retirement. It's something that you start when it's not something that you start when retirement is on the horizon. It's something that we need to plan for throughout our careers. So I'm really excited to have Crystal back so we can start looking at the building blocks of a successful succession plan and retirement strategy. Crystal, welcome. Good to talk to you again. Thanks for being here.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me.
So to get started, to kick things off, why is this important?
Well, I think this is probably one of the most important things that we can talk about with chiropractors, because I know from experience that very few chiropractors have a real understanding of how this process works. And we're at a very unique point in the chiropractic profession where we have more chiropractors contemplating retirement than we ever have had before. We have buyers that are coming in from outside of the chiropractic space interested in buying. And it's really important for our doctors to understand how this process works so that they can be well prepared.
So I think that one of the kind of foundational pieces of this is the practice value, and how do we arrive at the value of the practice. And when I talk to doctors out and about, I mean, when I ask the question, how have you valued your practice? I get all kinds of answers. So how do you do this?
We also get all kinds of answers, so I can appreciate where you're coming from with that. And it's complicated and it's a little bit confusing for the doctors. So, I try and break it down by helping them to understand that they may run into many different valuation formulas, talking with their CPA, talking with other chiropractors, people who own other types of businesses. And most of those formulas have nothing to do with the value of your chiropractic practice. So it's really important to be able to see through all that noise and understand that if your practice is open and it's generating a profit, then the formula that is going to serve as the foundation for your practice value is based on the transferable profit of your practice. It's not based on the gross collections. There's a lot of formulas floating around like that, and they're just not really that relevant. So when I tell doctors this, they immediately start to get nervous because they've been using all this different tax strategy over the years to try and minimize their profit, as most business owners do. And they worry that that means they're not going to be able to capture value when they go to sell their practice. And the good news is that's not necessarily true. Most buyers and most lenders have a comfort level with a relevant amount of tax strategy. And so we are able to recapture a lot of the value that's been expensed out that way. But it's important that it's done in an intentional and thoughtful way. And it's a bit of a process to get to that. So what we have to do is we have to start with the tax returns and look at the net profit on there and kind of work our way backwards to identify the tax strategy where the profit has basically been hidden in the expenses, identify those things, and then we do something called an add back adjustment where we remove that from the expenses and add it back to the profit. So this is things like the owner's wages and their benefits. It's also things like expenses that won't transfer to a new owner. For example, if you have an equipment lease that you've paid off or that would be paid off before the sale closed, then that all gets taken out. We also have to normalize the profit to a typical year because otherwise the expenses will look too high. So a great example of this is getting your tables refurbished. You might do that every 5, maybe 10 years. That's not a regular expense. So we need to take that out so it doesn't look like the overhead is higher than it really is. So once all those adjustments have been made and all of that has been added back to the net profit on the tax return, you have something called seller's discretionary earnings, or SDE. And that is what the new owner would benefit if they owned the practice during that same period of time. So that's the foundation for the practice value. To that, we apply a valuation multiplier. And that is just really a statement of risk for the new owner taking on this practice. How likely is it that the profit that the last owner was able to achieve will transfer to the new owner? And the banks that fund most business loans, they go through a program through the Small Business Administration, or the SBA. This loan program is to help people to move into entrepreneurship. So it guarantees loans for people who are buying businesses. So that program, it funds most of the loans that are used to buy small businesses, including chiropractic practices. At our firm, the SBA funds probably about 80 to 90% of the loans that we're doing on an annual basis, or of the practices that we're selling on an annual basis. So it's a significant component, and therefore they really set the marketplace for how businesses of all types are valued. So that lending program, they're actually establishing the range of valuation multiples that can be used for any type of business. So the valuator, whether they work for a lender or it's someone who is helping a buyer to establish the value for something they're looking at to purchase, they're going to start with that range of multiples, and then they're going to narrow it down based on some different criteria of the business. So for chiropractic, that tends to be the location of the practice. Is it a location that a lot of people are moving into, or is it somewhere where the population is actually declining? Another important factor is how big is that transferable profit, especially relative to the cost of living in the area. They're also going to look at the profitability of the practice, how much is left after all of the overhead is paid. And they're going to be looking at the trends of the practice. Is it growing? Is it in decline? Is it stable? And they're going to be looking at the transferability of it. Again, how likely is this to transfer from one person to another? Is everything built on the selling doctor? Is their face on all the billboards in town? Is there any staff that's going to stay after the sale to help support the new owner and help keep the patients around? So all of those factors play into where the valuation multiple will land for this specific practice within the range of what's possible for a business of this type. So there's work to identify the profit and there's work to identify the relevant multiple. But once you actually have those two things, the math is very simple. It's profit times multiple. So if you have a $200,000 SDE, or transferable profit, times a 1.5x multiple, then you would have a practice that was valued about 300,000.
I see. Well, I learned two new terms: transferable profit and SDE. So, already I've got more than what I started with. Really interesting topic, because, you work with this all the time, and, you have this down, and I think that that's a really important thing to understand, that there are people that do this, that there is help available, and we'll talk about some resources later on. But, this is kind of a new area for a lot of docs, and there is help available, and it's not just a guess as to what that, seems like it should be worth. That's not the way to do it. There is a method to this. So thanks for walking us through this. In your experience, what are the biggest challenges that chiropractors face in building a financially valuable practice? This is something that needs attention, and they need to be mindful of, right?
Oh, absolutely. It's so important for so many reasons. Like you said, so many doctors are relying on this for their retirement, and so few doctors understand how that valuation process works. And so what we see doctors who have really tried to, for example, build the practice as big as they possibly can, thinking that that's going to ultimately drive the value. But the truth is that you need to be really strategic with things like that, because a practice where you grow the gross collections, but the profit actually goes down, that will have valuation impacts on the negative side in a couple of different ways that most doctors don't realize when they're making those efforts. Also, if you're building that, but even the profit, if you can build the profit up, but it's not in a way that would be transferable to someone else. For example, if you're doing that through a lot of IME work or a lot of really, very niche techniques or modalities, not every buyer is going to be able to come in and do that or want to do that. And so then that ends up, impacting how transferable the profit is. And we've also seen doctors who, have really taken this message to heart, and they have said, okay, I'm going to work as hard as I can. I'm going to build this practice up. And they do, they do a great job. They get their profit, the transferable profit up a good amount, but it's not sustainable. And so then the practice ends up going down the next year. And a lot of times it'll go down even below where it was at before, because the doctor is exhausted and needs time off and vacations. Well, and now you have a situation where the transferable profit may be less than it was in the first place, and the practice is in a declining business trend, which also negatively impacts the valuation. So there's a lot of moving parts to this. It's not as simple or straightforward as doctors often think when, they hear a casually thrown around, rule of thumb on how a practice would be valued or what the multiple would be. It's just so much more complex than that.
Yeah. We've talked about some of this, but what are some of the common misconceptions that chiropractors have about the value of their practice, and how do these impact their retirement planning and ultimately their retirements?
I think some of the biggest problems that we see is, first off, the assumption that value is coming from other sources than the profit. So a lot of doctors that come to us ready for retirement, they had a practice of a certain size and then they got tired, or they didn't want to stop practicing, but they also didn't want to keep going at that level. So they stepped back, they started going to part-time hours. That really impacts the practice value, because once your practice has been in a point of decline, those previous higher numbers are basically kicked off the books. And that's a horrible realization for someone who, had a practice that was 2-3 times as big a few years ago, and they just didn't realize that was really the time to sell, and then maybe try and get, a position as a chiropractor, maybe in that practice, or doing some locum work so that they could still practice, but also maximize the return on their practice before it declined.
Yeah. So, this is something that, I think that retirement planning, no matter who you are, is something that you need to be thinking about really from day one. Um, and with chiropractors, on day one, you've got a lot to think about.
Yeah.
And then as the practice gets established and gets up and running, every practice is unique and different. What are some of the things that doctors need to be thinking about and watching out for, throughout their career, early in this process, and then throughout every stage of their practice, like family, how does family factor into this, as far as, what role do they play, if you're practicing with a family member? How does that work?
It's a great question. I think the lens that you have to look at these situations through is, transferability and the transferable profit. So if you have family members that are, we've seen practices where that's the whole practice, mom, dad, adult children, that's everybody in the practice. Well, when parents are ready to retire, if those children are also planning on leaving, then there's no one really left to stay with the practice, and that's a real hardship for the new owner, and therefore creates a lesser value. It creates more risk of the patients not staying because everyone they know is now gone. Same thing with a family member who is another practitioner. If they're planning on leaving, or if they feel like they own those patient files, and so therefore they might go down the street and open a practice, or they don't have a contract that would prohibit that from happening. All of those things create risk in a sale, and risk tends to lower the valuation significantly.
I see. So let's stay on the topic of family a little bit. Where do spouses fit in? They may have had a role in the practice, not necessarily as a doctor, but I know a lot of spouses that are the key manager. The key, the person, the kind of the glue, that keeps the whole practice together and running. Where do they fit in?
Yeah, there's some real interesting considerations to take into account there if that's your situation. So the first one is you have to imagine what would happen to the practice if the spouse just stopped doing what they're doing. So if it would not be a big deal, if other people on the team could easily pick it up with little to no, impact on the payroll, it's probably not a big deal. That's usually the spouse that, runs to Costco a couple times a month and gets office
Mhm.
supplies, that type of thing. But if it's truly, someone who is quarterbacking the office, running all the billing, no one knows what to do without them, you really need to hire someone who can be trained in all of those things, who will stay after the sale closes. Because the operation side of that practice is something that the new owner will know nothing about. And if they're also losing the glue, then everything falls apart. And one other thing that I would point out is that spouse wages can be complicated when you're thinking about practice value. So in some cases, the spouse isn't paid at all. Well, that creates a situation where there's a negative add back. So that's actually drawing the profit down from what's showing up on the financial statement, because somebody's going to have to be paid to do that. You can't assume that the new owner will also have a spouse, who can come in and work in the practice without requiring any pay. So that can be a surprise for some doctors, that that portion of the profit will disappear as part of the valuation process. And then on the flip side, if you have a spouse who is paid a lot, maybe over market wages, then you're going to have a situation where the buyer is going to feel anxious about adjusting those wages to market rate, if for someone who will be able to be as capable as the spouse.
Right. Right. Interesting. Yeah, there is so many dynamics to consider here. Another one is, associates. Is there I'm familiar with a lot of, docs that end up selling their practice to their associates. What does that look like?
Selling to an associate is a very delicate process. When it works out well, it is probably one of the most beautiful ways to transition your practice. Everyone feels so good about it. But the challenges that we see in that are that it's not really something that's usually has a lot of transparent communication and structure around. And that leads to a lot of problems because both sides are sort of forming these unspoken expectations of, what would be common sense for how a transaction like this would work. And then they finally come together, maybe 2 years down the road, and they realize that they do not have the same opinion of, common sense and logical ways of handling this. So it can create a lot of instability in the practice to assume that there's going to be an associate buyout without having a formal structure. Because when the associate leaves, that creates some ripples through patient care, through other staff. It can certainly change the energy in the practice. The seller, may not really want to come back and work at that level or might have a hard time replacing them. So if an associate buyout is part of your plan, it's really important to have a really intentional, thoughtful structure to that, as early as possible, ideally before they ever even start working in the practice, so that you don't run into those problems down the road.
Let's bring it back to valuation then. If I'm an associate working in a practice and I'm going to buy that practice, well, I'm a big part of that practice. Right? So does that impact the valuation of the practice?
Also a very delicate part of this situation, because you have the associate having exactly that thought, I helped build this. I am part of what is making this valuable. I should get some kind of discount. That's a common sentiment among associates. On the seller's side, it doesn't quite feel that way, because the seller's thinking, hey, I'm the one who's taken all the risk, whether you, were producing or not, I had to take care of certain things. There's usually a certain level of base salary. There's certain training that was put into place. I've invested in you over the years. And, if anything, you should pay more because you've gotten so much more out of me than, somebody else who would just come in and buy it and have a limited transition after the sale closes. So very much they're on opposite ends of that. And what we try and do when we're helping a doctor come up with an associate buyout strategy is we really try and focus on, what are you trying to achieve with this associate? Because depending on your ultimate goals with that associate buyout, you're just going to need to structure both the associateship and the sale differently to help achieve that. And certainly the value and the pricing of the practice will play into that.
Yeah. Interesting. Kind of along the lines of associates, but a very different relationship of business partners.
Mm-hmm.
You might have partners in, and I would imagine there are situations where one doc is ready to retire and sell. Another partner may be on the same timeline, may not be. How does this factor in?
Well, the interesting thing about that is, especially if you've got two chiropractors, you have to think about what that feels like to the new person coming into that situation. Because the truth is that value, a practice or anything is as valuable as the person who's buying it is willing to pay for it, right? And so the person coming into a partnership where one partner is planning on staying and the other one's leaving, well, first off, they have to basically be willing to get married to someone that they don't really know, because a business partnership is kind of like a marriage. And then if that other person is also a chiropractor with a practice in the same location, then there's a sense of, well, what am I buying here? Because I don't necessarily know that these patients who have been seeing this person for the last 20 years in the same office, how do I know they're not just going to flood to them versus me, who is a completely unknown entity? So that does play into the valuation, especially when you consider the person who's selling and their timeline and their goals and what they're willing to do to try and mitigate some of that.
Yeah. So finally, on this topic, of the different people in your practice and the impact that they are going to have on the valuation and the retirement strategy and the sale. What about real estate?
Mm,
because that's, a lot of doctors own their building. Um, and that real estate may be part of their plan as well. How this is going to play into this valuation too, right?
absolutely. It definitely does. And, in some cases, because of how practices are valued and how real estate is valued and just how much appreciation we've seen in real estate over the last several decades, sometimes the commercial real estate is more valuable than the practice. So it is really important to get an understanding of the real estate value at the same time as you're getting your valuation done of your practice. Those are just two key components to understand where you're at now so you can make a plan of, where you want to get to. The valuation of the real estate will dictate, one, if you plan to keep the real estate, how much rental income you'll get. So that can also
Mhm.
impact, what you need to get from your practice to make all of your number goals work. But it's also going to directly impact the value of the practice because, well, first off, the practice is valued based on the transferable profit, and rent being a repetitive expense that's usually, a fairly significant portion of the overhead, that's really going to impact the value of the practice, right? But on top of that, if you don't charge market rent for the real estate to try and keep the practice value up, then you can actually drive the value of your real estate down. So it's very intertwined.
Interesting. So let's kind of sum this all up a little bit. What strategies can chiropractors implement early in their careers to ensure that their practice grows in value so that they do have value there at the end of their careers to sell and retire, hopefully very comfortably?
Yep. Well, absolutely, hands down, every chiropractor who owns a practice should get a practice valuation just to understand what your baseline is so that you know where you're starting from.
Even if I'm, just 5 years in and I've got a very long time to go, I should get this valuation.
You really should for a couple of reasons. So, first off, that's the best time to put into place a long term plan to build value comfortably. And to have a retirement strategy in place that is going to support you and your life goals when you no longer want to or you no longer can practice. And that can happen sooner than people think, right? I mean, we have had some very sad situations that have come to us of doctors who you would never think would be unable to practice just based on, the pictures on their website, healthy, young, and things happen and life happens. Sometimes opportunities come up that drive the idea of, well, maybe we should do that instead. Maybe we should go there instead. What are you going to do with this practice? If you have an idea of what the value is, then you know if that is a feasible option for you. And then on top of that, if you are working with a company who is really experienced in chiropractic practice value, especially, then you can also get some exit strategy consulting in there. It's really not that expensive. And the insights on what you could do to build that value will give you such a clear path to follow. Because I have seen doctors that have focused on completely the wrong things, not knowing, it made sense, common sense logically, this should work. And it didn't, the math didn't work out. And you can actually take a practice that was fairly valuable and sellable and turn it into something that's not sellable by making some of the wrong decisions just from not knowing.
Yeah.
So, getting evaluation, getting some exit strategy guidance. And then, from there, it's really just focusing on a few things that you can really control. So the first one, transferable profit. Think about what the average chiropractor in your graduating class would be able to and want to do, and let that guide the vast majority of how you're focusing your practice. That's just a really good general guideline. Focus on the trends in your business. Don't, if your practice starts to go down because you no longer have the drive or the energy or the physical ability to keep the numbers up, it's time to start thinking about doing things differently. And then finally, thinking about just transferability. What are you building and how many people will be able to take that on or would want to take that on?
Okay. I think that, I work in insurance. So, planning for the unexpected is second nature to me. But I think that, chiropractors, particularly when they're young, well, I'm not going to need to transition out of this for decades from now. So why worry about it now? Well, it may not be decades. And that can be for a good or bad reason. It could be because of a health issue, disability, something like that. Or it could, like you said, another opportunity comes along that is something that you want to pursue and you need to exit. So, I think doing this groundwork and thinking about this, early as possible is only going to serve the doctor well down the road. The more we know, and that's better, right? So,
Absolutely.
Crystal, lot of information here, a lot of complex topics. What resources are available to chiropractors who want to prepare their practices for a successful retirement and want more information on how to go about that?
Well, we do have some booklets on how practices are valued and understanding the process of buying and selling practices. The more you know, the better you understand what that future process looks like, the better you can prepare for it. I think that when we talk to doctors who are ready to sell, one of the biggest surprises to them is how much work they have to do to prepare because they didn't do anything in advance. So just knowing what that process looks like is huge. So I would definitely recommend, looking into that. We'll give you guys those resources to share.
Yep.
Spend 30 minutes reading through it and you'll just have a real appreciation for what that looks like in the future. And
Yep.
we also do complimentary consultations and go through all of this a little bit more in depth and target it to the person's exact practice. We can't really do a number on the phone because it's just not that simple. But I think just talking to someone about your unique situation is also helpful because the truth is that chiropractic practices are all so different and so unique. And so, getting some more targeted guidance as well, just to kick off your thinking process and make plans for the future, always a good idea.
Yep. And for our viewers, we will post the resources that Crystal mentioned. We'll post those along with the recording of the webinar in the show notes. So please take a look at that. Crystal, one more question. And I should have asked this up front, but tell us a little bit about Progressive Practice Sales. You are a lead broker for them, and we've worked together for quite a while now. But tell us a little bit about Progressive Practice Sales. And then in general, what is the role of a broker? What value does a broker bring to this? And I kind of liken this to, residential real estate. You can sell your house on your own, right? But there are real estate agents that can help you through that process and help you get through it. So what's the role of a practice broker and Progressive Practice Sales?
Yeah, absolutely. So my husband and I co-founded Progressive Practice Sales almost 10 years ago, and it was after we sold our third practice. And we just realized going through this process how complicated all of this is. And when we were going through it, we never felt like we had the support that we needed. We were always very confused and felt kind of adrift. So we decided to build the brokerage that we really felt like the chiropractic profession needed because I have a business degree, my husband's a serial entrepreneur. Most chiropractors didn't become chiropractors because they wanted to get an MBA and be business people. They're healers. And that just adds an additional layer of complication in because these are complex business transactions. So, that's how we've built everything that we do is looking at, well, what does the chiropractor need in this situation and how can we make this easier and more accessible for them to have success? Because when you look at business sales overall, the numbers are not great. The overall success rate for a business listed for sale, according to Forbes magazine, is only about 20%. It's an
Wow.
abysmal success rate when you think about how much these doctors are putting into their practices, over the course of their lives. Now, the good news is, you can completely reverse those odds, but you really need a practice sale that is well managed. You need a practice price that's appropriate for the marketplace. And you need someone who's just really going to be active in making sure that your sale is getting the right marketing and the right attention. And so, that is the real job of the broker. A lot of people would look at a broker and think, okay, well, your job is to find a buyer, and that's really all that we need you for. But the truth is that that's a very small portion of the work that we do. It can sometimes take a while, depending on your practice and where it's located and how specialized your clinic is. But the truth is that the role of the broker is to manage that transaction. And that transaction, in our firm, it takes an average of 300 hours of the broker team time. So it's a massive lift of effort, from preparation of the practice, management of all of the different communications with the prospective buyers and the lenders and the attorneys and the CPAs, and just making sure that everything's being done to get you to a point of success. So having that management of the sale and having the guidance so that you can avoid the pitfalls, and then when things go wrong, successfully navigate around them, that's what you're looking for in a broker.
Yeah. Two thoughts. One, it seems to me a mistake in this area would be very time consuming and expensive, potentially.
Yes.
One. Two, you said 300 hours of broker time to get this through. From the doctor's perspective, from the day I pick up the phone and say, hey, Crystal, I want to sell my practice, to closing, what are we looking at? How long?
So the average number that's kind of thrown around in the chiropractic space for a practice sale is 12 to 18 months.
Okay.
When people talk about that, though, they don't necessarily think about, well, is this practice in a well-known location? Is my clinic, is it a standard technique or a very niche technique? Mm-hmm. So timelines can certainly be outside of that. We see lower timelines than that quite frequently, but it's because of the fact that we're very aggressive in our marketing strategy and our buyer management. And so you can do things to impact that. Mm-hmm. But it's better for chiropractors to plan for a longer sale timeline, because there's a little bit of an element of luck in that too, as far as if you're listing at a time when a buyer who's a great fit is in the marketplace, or if your particular clinic, has some unique aspects that are going to make it take a little bit longer.
All right. Thank you. Well, Crystal, I think that we'll go ahead and stop there. Thank you very much. This is great information. I learned a ton. I always enjoy talking with you. So thank you for being here and joining us. Before we go, I would like to remind our listeners of our resources section on ncmic.com. This webinar will be posted there, along with a library of past webinars on a wide variety of topics. And we also have lots of articles and information for your practice. So we're continually adding to our content to help you navigate the daily practice and deal with the challenges that you face. So please check that out. You can also keep up to date on new resources from NCMIC by following us on social media on Facebook, LinkedIn, and Instagram. And once again, Crystal, thanks for joining us from Progressive Practice Sales. Thanks for the great information, and thank you to our viewers for joining us. Have a great day.